would now request ma'am to please enlighten our audience.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. As the speaker said, that yes, I'm Dr. Tina Mistry. I am in the UK, and currently it's snowing here, so we're enjoying the snow. So it's a nice change for us currently living in the lockdown. So I guess the conversation that we're having today is about how to manage work-life balance during the pandemic. And for many of us, this is a totally different way of working. We are so used to being in environments where we are expected to be in a specific office or academic space. So for many of us who are treading this new territory, we're having to reevaluate the way that we work, but also it's testing us not only sort of academically or kind of on a work basis, but also psychologically. And that's the angle that I'm going to be talking about today. So for those who've not worked in a environment like working from home, it's readjusting and relearning or unlearning ways that we have traditionally worked and learning new ways of working within a space that we would always see as a rest place or a place where we can relax. So for many of us, that's been probably the biggest struggle. And a lot of psychological research talks about how environment does dictate our ability to learn. There was a study years ago which talked about how we can have cues around us which can help us to memorize things or help us to learn things. Now, if those parts of those environment are there when we need it for recall, it enhances our ability to remember things. So this environment is hugely, hugely important. So for many of us, like I said before, if we're used to relaxing and, you know, kind of being in our kind of social space at home, to be able to get into a space of studying or focus or kind of creativity where we're expected to produce stuff, that's quite hard. So that's the first thing that I wanted to talk about. And the other issue is, I guess this pandemic has made us realize that there are so many things out of our control. And for many of us, working in these conditions is out of our control. It may not be our first choice. So this is, again, a shift that we're having to learn to accept and adapt to. Can I have the next slide? I wanted to talk about introversion and extroversion, get my teeth in and speak correctly. And as we know that we can be anywhere along this spectrum, you know, for many people who like to be in the presence of other people, who get energized by being around other people, I would probably class them as more extrovert, and that they feel like their batteries are charged when they are with other people. That's where I would see that, you know, that's where extroversion usually lies. But we can kind of, you know, move between those spaces. And then we've got our introverts, and our introverts actually find those social spaces hugely depleting. So it takes away our energy. We find those situations quite overwhelming. We can manage them from time to time, but actually we need our own time and space to recharge. So that's one thing that we need to be mindful of, is actually being in our own spaces. How are we finding it? Are we finding that actually we feel more settled in ourselves, or are we feeling like we need that energy, that charge, by being surrounded by other people? And again, it's about noticing when we feel depleted or when we feel energized, and knowing what we need to be calling upon during those times. And I'll come back to this a little bit later. So each of us are going to have individual ways of coping with these situations, depending on kind of our traits or our states. And often, I guess, what we forget is the positive and the negative around being in a work environment or an academic environment, like a school environment or a university or college environment, that these spaces are designed specifically for education, learning, productivity. But also, let's not forget the social aspect of being in these spaces. For many students, not only is that space for academic learning, but it's also a space where they learn social skills on how to negotiate and how to learn to make friends or manage conflict. And then as we become adults, we're doing that in the work environment as well. We're negotiating conversations, we're trying to handle conflict, we're trying to get our needs met in different ways. And actually that fulfills us on a social level as well. And that, we forget the importance of that being in these specific environments, which can help us to develop our emotional intelligence, I guess, in many ways. So some might find the shift to working from home quite difficult, and others actually might be like, yes, this is brilliant, finally I can kind of be in my own space. I don't have to constantly be bombarded by people's interruptions or conversations, and also not having long commutes. For some people, that can be quite difficult, and for others it can be quite refreshing to have that kind of difference, I guess, in many ways. Next slide, please. So I guess the other thing that I wanted to mention is that as much as we, the introverts who are on this particular spectrum, they also do need connection. I think that's a fundamental human need, and we can't ignore that for those people who I've worked with as a psychologist have really struggled with the lack of connection with other people. So we, as much as we think that not being in the work environment or the school environment has been helpful, they've actually missed that social connection to people and being in spaces where people exist. So as much as it is a good thing, it actually does have a negative impact. It increases our sense of isolation and loneliness, which we know then could lead to mental health difficulties such as depression or low mood. So another thing that we need to be mindful of is the shift between real life in connection or interaction versus this virtual conference, kind of visual way of interacting. We probably are experiencing more email communication, more screen time. And this then leads to often the lack of nuance, the lack of kind of, the gentle interpretation that we might have when we're in the company of somebody. Let's not forget that actually, a high percentage, between, I think it's 70 to 80% of communication is actually non-verbal. So what does that mean? That means that most of our body and our face does a lot of the communication. And as human beings, we're very good at reading other people. So when that's missing, and that's usually done by email or kind of by video conferencing, where you might not have the greatest internet connection, a lot of that stuff might be missed, which may cause problems in communication. So we have to be very mindful of how that is done. And I'm going to go on to talk a little bit about Zoom fatigue or video conferencing fatigue a little bit later, where we need to pay attention to that and how that actually does have a psychological impact on us. So the other things that we need to be thinking about is, what about the people who have never worked from home and all of a sudden they're being forced to be, working from home? They need to set up a desk. They need to have an ergonomic space where they can work properly. So can they reach things easily? Do they have a desk? Many people in the UK, don't normally typically work from home. And, a lot of businesses have struggled to meet the demands to make sure that their employees are carefully cared for during this time. So, some people might have back problems, some people may have eyesight problems. So actually it is the employer's responsibility to make sure that the health and safety risk assessment is done so that their health is not further detrimented as a result of changing the way their working environment is. So we've got to make sure we've got the correct equipment, making sure that our laptops are at a specific height, we've got the right chair, making sure the space is right. And we have to bear in mind that not everybody is going to have that. Some of us live in very tight, small spaces. And how's that going to make us feel working, living, eating in the same environments that we're constantly being, expected to be in? We know that that's not ideal, but sadly, this is the state of affairs that, many people are finding themselves, which again is having an impact on their sense of well-being. The other thing that we need to think about, I guess, is, next slide. Sorry, I've covered that. Zoom fatigue. Let's go to that. Now, this is a concept that I don't think many people have understood or have fully appreciated. But one of the things that we have been learning since March 2020 was that after all these people started to work from home, people started to experience headaches, fatigue, low mood. And psychologists who were working within organizations termed this concept of Zoom fatigue, which is the mental exhaustion associated with online video conferencing. Now, myself as a psychologist, I worked face to face prior to the lockdown in the UK. And then I had to quickly switch over to virtual conferencing like this. So as a therapist, I had to be very, very careful on how I was reading people's signals. Now, my sessions are usually an hour long where I'm working with people who have mental health issues. But we're talking about here, kind of academics, professionals working together, trying to have these online meetings where we're trying to flip between different screens. We're trying to read people's facial languages and also listen into the tones that they use within their voices. Now, as you know, and as I know, our voices don't quite sound the same when it's transmitted via the internet. It actually is quite difficult for our audio system to process. And actually, that is one of the causes for what we class Zoom fatigue, that actually our brain is overwhelmed by the sounds and the sensations, but also the visual processing that occurs during an online conference. And there's things that we can be doing. So, for example, muting ourselves if we're not talking, having shorter meetings, encouraging better online conference etiquette, and reducing background noise and using of the chat functions. So some ideas that we can encourage our colleagues to help us with when it comes to doing this video conferencing. Go to the next slide, please. I think I touched on ergonomics in terms of having an ideal workspace, and there's lots of people that will probably be able to be talk about that in a more informed way than myself. The things that I'm particularly encouraging clients and general public to be doing is thinking about routine. Now, for many of us, waking up in the morning and knowing that we've got to go to work or go to school or go to university, it encourages a sense of routine. But however, when we are now living, learning, breathing, exercising, relaxing, and creating and doing everything in this one space, how do we even separate that? So there's some things that we can try. For example, we know that having a routine where we start at a specific time and finish at a specific time is very helpful, because then we can create a boundary between work and rest. So also encouraging breaks. Now, at work or at school, you may have regular breaks already within your school timetable or work timetable. Again, we need to be putting this in place for ourselves. It's our responsibility to take care of our routines and making sure we go on regular breaks, making sure we hydrate and eat regularly. And the small things that we can do that, I've had conversations with colleagues about, like having a coffee at the beginning of the day before we sit down, that could be something that could be helpful. Having a walk around the block at the end of the day to almost simulate a commute, because actually we forget the importance of a commute, that as much as it can be quite difficult and busy and stressful, it actually allows us to decompress what has happened at work, so that we're creating this space between work and home or work and rest. Can I have the next slide, please? So there's some healthy habits that we need to continue to do. Sleep. We know, I can't stress the importance of sleep. Making sure that we have a regular pattern, just as we do for work or school, that we have, approximately 8 hours a day. And again, we vary. Some of us are more likely to need a little bit more, some of us need less. And again, it also depends on what we're doing during the day. If you're anything like me, I'm sat most of the day because I'm seeing clients face to face, I probably don't need that much sleep. Whereas somebody who, may be engaging in more physical behaviors during the day, they may need more sleep, but we're all different. But what I would be recommending is making sure that, your sleep time and your wake time is regular-ish, so that then that creates that sense of routine. And what you'll find is that more that you try and encourage a habit like that, your body will get used to it, and your body will then allow you to wind down at a certain time and allow you to wake up at a certain time. Movement is, again, a huge positive thing that we need to keep doing. Many of us who felt the first wave of kind of being in the lockdown, we just all went into a state of shock. We almost shut down in many ways. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know how to cope. Many of us were using gyms as exercise or using outdoor spaces. And for these people, it was a bit of a shock. How do I start to exercise within my own space? And it can be small things like yoga, like Pilates or meditation, anything that's gentle, or it can be something that is more vigorous, like a HIIT workout or a run or a walk. As long as we are moving, that will keep our bodies feeling good. It'll encourage us to eat the right foods and drink the right things. So that will then, again, obviously impact on our sleep and our overall well-being. And as I've touched on nutrition, again, these are like the foundation things that we should be trying to do: sleep, movement, nutrition. Okay, next slide, please. This is the one thing that I feel like many of us are struggling with, because as a society, we are so used to being in the company of others, which then creates moments of connection. Now, for those people who are working on the front line and for those working at home, burnout is real. And burnout is when we notice that we're no longer ourselves. We may be irritable more, we may be feeling frustrated, or we may not be sleeping well. And burnout is caused by the fact of feeling overwhelmed by what's happening around us. And this could be for many reasons. So in the UK, we're having to homeschool a lot of our children. For the frontline workers, it is obviously an increase of demands. So, for the people that are working in hospitals, our doctors and nurses, the COVID patients are there, but also the regular patients are there as well. So there's a lot happening for many people who are both working from home or on the front line. And this is the crucial bit, because we know that burnout actually is something that can affect us psychologically, but actually one of the ways in which we can help with burnout and to eradicate or soothe burnout is through connection. And when I talk about connection, I'm talking about our ability to express. So first of all, become aware that we're feeling, irritated or burnt out, naming it, and also then trying to express that with a friend or a colleague or somebody you trust, who you trust. Sometimes we can't spot it ourselves. And, it might be a good idea to say to a friend or a colleague or somebody, say, if you ever notice that I'm kind of acting differently, or you're noticing that I'm irritable, call me out. Call me out gently. Could you just like check in with me to see if I'm okay? And you can create a buddy up system as well. And what that allows is for conversation, because sometimes we can't see it when we're in our own dark spaces. We don't want to burden other people with our problems, because, let's face it, we feel like that everybody else is going through way worse than what we are. But actually, we need each and every one of us to be the best version of ourselves as possible during this very difficult time. There's other things that we can do to help ourselves engage in our own psychological awareness and insight. So things like engaging in hobbies, making time to speak with friends and family over the phone or via FaceTime or Zoom or whatever works, and connection to yourself. And this is this can be spiritual, this can be journaling, this can be meditation, this can be religious. It can be anything that works for you. But the crucial bit is to give yourself permission to give yourself 5 minutes to yourself, for yourself, because we have to fill our own cups before we can give to others. And that's, across the board, whether we're frontline workers, whether we're students, whether we're office workers, or whether we're doing any other jobs. Each of our jobs requires us to be something for someone. So it's hugely important that if we can be the best versions of ourselves, we can give our best versions to everybody else around us. And the other thing that I would be talking about is social media. As much as it is a positive thing, we can create community there, we can have conversations, we can learn things. It also can fill us with messages which may make us feel overwhelmed or make us feel inadequate. So just be very, very mindful and notice if you're finding yourself thinking about things that, you're not good enough, or, I need to try harder, or things aren't working well. And any sort of negativity that you might notice, maybe it might be time for you to just give yourself a social media break. And this is something I encourage to a lot of people, is that just taking a break from that overwhelm and just plugging out and switching off and enjoying things that are physically around us in our systems is hugely beneficial. Okay, next slide. So I guess the final thing that I want to remind us all is that all of us are struggling in our own ways. Okay. This is a pandemic, a global pandemic, and we don't often think about how this is affecting each family or each individual. And we may hear from other people, oh, such and such is happening in so and so's family, such and such, and we may feel, oh gosh, we're not that bad, thank gosh, or whatever. But actually, we are experiencing what we would call a collective trauma. And what that means is that as a global community, this is affecting us, and that it is okay to feel strong emotions about this. We may have experienced a loss of a loved one, which I think is hugely common. So it's okay to feel feelings of grief. But even if you haven't lost a loved one, you may have lost opportunities. You may have lost potentials to do things. You may have lost the opportunity to travel, let's say. They are still moments of grief that we need to acknowledge and accept. Okay. And by accepting and acknowledging them, even whether if it's through a conversation, even if it's through journaling or seeking professional help, it's important that we process this. It's important to acknowledge that each and everyone's experiences are valid. You know, nobody's is worse than the other. Everybody's going through different things. I use the analogy of different boats, same storm in the ocean. Okay. If you imagine we are all in this storm right now, all in this big ocean, and we've all got different sized boats. Some of us may be in cruise ships, some of us may be in small, battered, little boats, but we're all going through this. And if we keep steering ourselves in the direction in which we believe we need to be in, based on our values, we will get there. This is something that we will all get through in some shape or form, but it is totally normal to experience some level of psychological distress through this very difficult time. So if you feel that your mental health is slipping into a place where you're unable to function anymore, please reach out. There are professional helplines, there are professional organizations that you can contact, within your regions. And again, I just want to remind you that we all need to be gentle